Thank you, Dirk. Good to see everybody. Absolutely delighted to have been invited to this and to share some of the, I suppose, my own experience as well as the research insights that have come from the last number of years engaging with this theme, around trying to understand the lives of young men, the experiences of young men, and a lot of that, as the earlier presenters had mentioned, a lot of that's often quite hidden. So thanks very much for the invitation, and I have to say well done to the YLT and the ARK for organising this. There's a lot of work, as I'm sure most of us can appreciate, goes into organising events like this, and the German efficiency didn't go unnoticed as well. When I think it without exception, it must be the first event that has started bang on, to the second. So well done that. I have to keep an eye on my own time then, just to keep up with that. So as Dirk said, I'm Colm Walsh, lecturer in criminology at Queen's, and I'm delighted to have been appointed quite recently to that post. Like a lot of my colleagues at Queen's and indeed at Ulster, their influence, precedes their entry in the academia, which kind of makes sense. And Chris spoke about that in his kind of formative experiences in the community and voluntary sector. It was minded actually whenever I saw Joe earlier. We had a bit of a laugh a few weeks ago, Joe Hawkins, about growing up in West Belfast and some experiences, growing up there in the 1980s. And then I suppose really my formative experiences began whenever I undertook the postgrad diploma and then the masters in community youth work. At the same time I was working in practice. And it did get a bit of a flashback, and I'll touch a wee bit on trauma in a wee while, but it did get a bit of a flashback when I walked into the room and I saw Chris Quinn, who was in the class and was renowned for looking over my shoulder and copying assignments, and Susan Morgan, who then fielded both of us. So those experiences were formative, and they kind of ran in parallel to the work that was going on in the community. And I began my practice engaging with boys and young men, and I could relate, to a lot of what they were going through, and that work kind of took me into more, I guess we would call now, as we put, these frames around practice, more specialist, I guess it would be called now, working with young men who were particularly at risk, who were both victims of serious violence and other kind of contextual harms, but quite often were also involved in violence themselves. Whether or not they were involved in the justice system, they were kind of caught up in these cycles of victimisation and perpetration. And in practice, I guess, as I moved through a range of different organisations, and as I kind of reflect, probably tried to navigate in the other spaces, it kept coming back to these things of harm and violence and context, and trying to make sense of that, ultimately trying to make the lives of boys and young men of better and safer, and communities safer. But some frustrations set in, I guess, and some of those frustrations were firstly around the voices of young men were quite often missed. There was also a frustration that I recognise good practice. There's really good things that go on in communities and really good practice that happens, particularly in the community and voluntary sector that's been mentioned already, but they're caught up in funding cycles, and quite often that's very short-lived, and without a real good evidence base around what's going on, the funding is cut. That tends to be a pattern. That has always been the pattern. And so there was a frustration around a lack of evidence. But having been in practice and led on some of these programmes, I also had to recognise and hold my hands up that we quite often in practice missed the opportunity to embed and lift good evidence, from outside, and actually embed that into practice. So there was a number of things going on. But ultimately, I felt well placed to move out of practice and more into the research and academia, and that's where I am now, ultimately trying to improve practice and give voice to boys and young men, particularly around these themes, but from a slightly different perspective. So whenever I was thinking about the how do I summarise in 20, 25 minutes a number of research projects and quite complex issues? We're talking about big things, a bit like, Katie was talking about big constitutional issues, where I'm talking about big complex social issues like violence and legacy and paramilitarism and organised crime and all the other issues that go with that. How do you summarise that? And I did struggle with it for a bit, and I deliberated, and I thought, well, what are the kind of key messages that I think have been coming out of the research? How does this all knit together? And I struggled with it so much, I thought, do you know what, I'll ask a young man. And it just so happened that I have been working with a guy from Sonic Arts Centre in Queens, so no background in youth work, no background in violence prevention, but he's doing a bit of work trying to essentially sonify some of the work, which is really cool. So what's the space on that? How can we turn research, empirical research into sound? I've no idea, but it sounds pretty cool. I think we'll see what the output is. But anyway, so I said to Isaac, some of you might know him, and he's incidentally got his Bible today. So I said to him, look, you've been reading this stuff for the last few weeks. And this is on an email. What are you taking from it? Give us a couple of headlines. What you're taking away from it? What are you reading into it? And so rather than an email, being from the Sonic Arts Centre, he sent me this. So I'll just play this for a few seconds.
Violence is a big issue. Research has found that over 80% of the youth in the justice system had committed violent offences, showing how prevalent violence is. It's a particularly big issue for young men. Young men were more likely to experience paramilitary violence. Young men face higher risks of paramilitary harm, indicating a gender dimension to the violence crisis. Academia can help communities develop solutions. Recommendations include implementing minimum standards for recording and sharing health data on violence and integrating data across health, police and community sectors to inform prevention. Academia can help by leveraging data to guide communities in developing coordinated solutions.
So I thought, well, aside from the method that he chose to respond to the email, I thought that was pretty cool. But also I thought, you know what, there is something there's a number of quite straightforward, simple messages in that. And what I took from his reading was that, first of all, we continue to have a serious, a challenging, an intimate relationship with violence. And, we talk about post-conflict, post-98, Good Friday Agreement, but we also need to recognise that in pockets and in clusters, there are communities that continue to experience quite significant harm, and there are populations within those communities that continue to experience quite a lot of violence in a whole range of ways. The second thing that I took from Isaac's interpretation of of his reading of the research was that in some ways boys and young men are particularly affected, and they're particularly affected. There's a huge gender dimension to this, and I know Gail and Siobhan are going to talk about the experiences of girls and young women later, but from the perspective of boys and young men, there's a particular vulnerability to physical violence. But maybe to end on what Dirk said, look, this shouldn't be doom and gloom, this is a bit of celebration, and to kind of embed a little bit of hope. I suppose one of the most hopeful things that I'm glad that Isaac had picked out was that there are actually some glimmers in here. A lot of these issues are understandable, these issues are potentially preventable, and when we work together, when we join academia, research, embed those research insights to the people and the places that could benefit most from them, things can happen. So what I'm going to try to do then for the remainder of the time is leverage a number of research projects that I have been involved with within this theme, and I suppose try to knit it together and work through these chapters that were recommended by Isaac. So chapter 1, I guess, is that look, we continue to have this issue with violence. It's better than it was. I was speaking at a symposium a few weeks ago in Craigavon, and on reflection ahead of that, I was thinking, for the last year and a half, and the lead up to all the celebrations and the backslapping around the anniversary of Good Friday Agreement, there was a bit of a sentiment that things have improved, or at least they're better than it was, and that's probably true. In fact, it is true. But what we also hear is that there are a considerable number of people who continue to be affected, sometimes in ways that we don't really recognise or equate with conflict-related violence. And this has been one of the, I suppose, the game-changer insights for me. So I hadn't intended in researching or working with partners to address legacy, to understand legacy, to make sense of the structure and the functions of organised criminal gangs within communities here. But the research led us to that in some ways, because just to draw on this study, it was a review of administrative data looking at violence across society as a whole. That was very illuminating. It was funded by the executive programme on paramilitarism, criminality and organised crime, and you see some members of the programme team here. So, but that was quite seminal, because what, at least in my mind, reinforced was that we have these behaviours that we kind of call violence, and the police report on them, and the things that are kind of clustered and nested within a broad term of violence against the person, and actually in completely separate sections of police reports we also have a separate presentation that's clustered and nested within what we call security related statistics. But what was quite interesting during this review of data, of administrative data, was that it wasn't just the pattern that in some ways violence was increasing, some forms were decreasing. It wasn't the trend, it was actually the correlation between these two things. And I don't mean that just visually it looks like there's some kind of relationship, but statistically there was a correlation between violence against the person and security related statistics. So in essence, there generally, as there was movement in one area, there was movement in another area, which was really enlightening. And how much and to how extent was this continuing to happen? So we kind of think, you know, if we're relatively untouched by organised criminality, by paramilitarism, paramilitary threat, paramilitary intimidation, physical violence, coercion, then we're relying on mainstream news, which appears to show that it's quite limited. But the more that the data was emerging, particularly through the programme, the executive programme, and then subsequent empirical studies, we're seeing that, you know, there were some estimates that around 30% of the population continue to be exposed by paramilitary type violence, which is shocking. And then when we dig into data and we look in the areas that are most affected, actually close to half of people living in some of these communities report being exposed to paramilitary type violence. And this is quite a cool, again, this is just setting the scene, like, you know, that we continue to have this issue in a range of different ways. I don't know if anybody recognises this. Anybody know what that is? The outline? What was that? The data, yeah, but the outline, what are we looking at? It's a map, musically, of, yeah. So, and the funny thing is this wasn't actually published, this was open source data, police data for a 1 year period, April 20 to March 21. Each dot is an incident of violence, and the map actually generated itself whenever you plot out where violence was taking place, which was amazing in itself, that you can actually make out the map of NI just by plotting down incidences of violence. And so, I don't know what your takeaways are from this, and sometimes these single visuals are quite powerful, because they communicate a really, you know, complex message and quite succinctly. And I guess, not sure if you'll still be able to hear me, but we'll try. You know, unless you live somewhere in Lough Neagh, you know, or you know, the Glens of Antrim, or the Spurns, or the Mourns, you know, pretty much everybody else at some point is close to, or is affected by, impacted by, exposed to some form of violence, which just gives a sense of how much is going on and how many of us are affected. But we're all not affected equally, and we're not all impacted equally. This report that looked at the Young Life and Times and actually Northern Ireland Life and Times as well. It was a synthesis across a number of years looking at experiences and attitudes. Found that maybe unsurprisingly, young people are most affected. Young people were less likely than older than adults to report that they felt unsafe in their communities. They were much more likely to be attuned to risk, and they were much more likely to feel that they were potentially the victims of violence. And that's not just academic, that's not just an academic exercise to try to understand perceptions, but it has a material impact in a whole range of ways. One of the ways that we can see that this has an impact is on well-being, subjective well-being, how young people feel in themselves, and as measured or as captured by the young person behaviour and attitude survey, which was a slightly different survey. And what we can see here through this data is that the less safe that young people feel, the lower their scores on well-being measures. And then if we dig down even further, which is really what where my research has been going, it's been funneling down. So let's understand what's going on at what's the big picture, and then trying to dig down until we really forensically understand what's going on, because it's only really by understanding what's going on and what's contributing to it that communities and practitioners, and there's a lot of people in the room, that then take this data and do something meaningful with it and have an impact on communities. So Mandy's here. This is based on data from the projects that she manages. They're operating across Northern Ireland. So 2021, an evaluation of Mandy's projects compared the experiences of around 700 young people working and being supported by EA and a range of community and voluntary organisations. How are their experiences different from the general youth population? And we can see significant differences across a range of metrics. Exposure to any form of trauma, exposure to violence, but as well, when we screen for probable PTSD, we can see significant changes in these populations, which is not just showing and giving us clues around what young people are being exposed to and how that's different depending on where they live, but also the potential impact of some of these things. So, again, funneling down further, we can see that in what ways are young people exposed to different forms of violence. You've taken Young Life and Times data in 2022, we can see that girls and young women are significantly more likely to experience some forms of violence, threat, intimidation, such as coercive control, where boys and young men are much more likely to report being the victim of physical assault. And this pattern and these findings are consistent across a whole range of really reliable data. So again, young person's behaviour and attitude survey, this is actually under review at the minute, this paper. But again, when we break down a whole range of different forms of physical violence, we can see significant differences between boys and young men and girls and young women, all statistically significant differences. So remember this, whenever I had put this figure up a few minutes ago, that the less safe that young people feel, the greater the reductions in their subjective well-being. Again, this has a real consequences on individuals and real impacts on communities. A case file review in 2021, where myself and a couple of colleagues had looked at the reasons why a group of young people found themselves in Woodlands, JJC, our Juvenile Justice Centre. We took a 1-year cohort and looked at their age, a whole range of demographics, why they were there, but also their backgrounds. And what we found across the board was that, maybe unsurprisingly, that there was the exposure to trauma and adversity was endemic. But what was interesting was that the young people who were known to have been victims of violence were 9 times more likely than those who weren't to have been convicted of a violent offence. And then we looked a wee bit deeper and we found that those who had been victims of paramilitary type violence were significantly more likely to have been convicted of a serious violent offence. And that tends to be to involve maybe the use of sharps, weapons and sharps. A later study then looked a wee bit further and tracked, okay, what happens to these, we can't, that group in Woodlands, who would have been on average 16 years old, we could wait, 10, 15 years and track them, which would be fantastic to do, and we haven't got to that place yet, but we could take a similar population and look at, well, where are they at and how do we track back their journeys? And so there's another programme, it's actually delivered by Probation. It's specifically for young men who are still considered young, under the age of 30, and who have been victims of paramilitary type violence. And in this group, what we can see is that all of them, and I guess that's because the nature of the programme had been the victims of paramilitary type violence, but really interestingly, only half of them had ever had a mental health diagnosis, and only around 11% had had a trauma screen. And that in itself, the fact that they're on this programme and they were known to have been victims and they had been caught up and involved in the justice system, probably should have been enough of a red flag. But in this qualitative exploration, exploratory study, what we also saw in the narratives and how these guys explained their journeys and the missed opportunities that were there from services and the whole range of complex and often difficult experiences that they had. Not only did where they ended up make sense, it makes sense why some of these people were where they were, but also it related very, very clearly to some of the younger guys who were involved in these earlier intervention type programs. The profile, their experiences, their responses to those experiences were almost identical, and so they weren't the same people, but we could almost plot out a trajectory, which was quite sad, but also give us which give some insights into how those trajectories could be interrupted before a new group of young men come through similar journeys. And so we heard quite a number of really consistent messages, and you can probably make these out, but what I want to do while you're just looking at that is read this extended excerpt. And what Dirk's looking at his watch, so am I okay for it? I'm okay for a bit of time. And I'll read this out. I'll read a bit of it out and see where we're going. And this is, I'm reading this partly because it tells a fuller story, but also a lot of what this guy's saying is reflective of a lot of the research. And I'll give you some links to the research you can read yourselves after. Well, it's just the way it is. Do you know what I mean? And by the way, you might have noticed at the start, I had put just, do you know what I mean at the start? This is something that I have really noticed the last couple of weeks. This keeps coming through in the transcript, something that I hadn't noticed whenever I was working through the projects individually. That symposium I was talking about a few weeks ago, I realised that across one project, I kept saying using this phrase, do you know what I mean? And it wasn't accidental, and whenever you're interviewing somebody one-on-one, it feels like a bit of it can feel like a bridge, in a conversation, or maybe just to fill a gap. But actually, whenever, for the symposium, I realised that was coming through, there was a pattern within that study, and in preparation for this, I looked at a range of other transcripts, and it was coming through and not coming through again, at important times, either seeking clarification, or potentially because some of these young men, when they're describing difficult things, maybe don't have the vocabulary, don't quite know how to articulate what it is that they were experiencing. So anyway, you'll hear that phrase peppered throughout it. So, well, it's just the way it is. Do you know what I mean? Like, especially growing up here, where I was growing up, I've seen a lot of people getting about beatings and stuff like that, and beatings with weapons and stuff like that, and stabbed. Do you know what I mean? When I was 15 or 16, I was obviously, I got a threat from the police. They called my house, they gave me a leaflet, and they said I was under threat. Criminal Elements, the first one was from. And then I got took to a bar by 3 men. They just questioned me about it, but they had masks on, and one was standing in the background with a gun. The next time, my dad and my dad's mate had to take me to the bar, and then my dad's mate walked me up the stairs, and then I was walking up the stairs, and I got pulled into the side room, and there were 3 men in the room, and they made me sit down. And your man started questioning me, slamming his hands on the table and stuff like that there. And then obviously they were questioning me about stuff that was happening in the area. Do you know what I mean? But my dad, he said, listen, you'll be alright, do you know what I mean? They're not going to touch you or nothing. But I knew what was happening, because obviously, like, a few of my mates were took to the same bar and stuff like that, do you know what I mean? I ended up getting attacked, and I ended up losing the sight in one of my eyes. So after that there, I just went back to my ma's, and I didn't really leave the house. I just stayed in every day, taking prescription drugs and cannabis and alcohol and stuff like that there. Yeah, I've always had mental health problems since the attacks, but I never really addressed them, you know? Like, it was, instead of going and getting help, I would have took drugs instead to block it out and stuff like that. And then, from then, it just sort of spiraled out of control with the drugs, do you know what I mean? So I started, obviously, abusing drugs heavier and stopped going to school. And I suppose I was associating with older people who were older than me, who I knew and grew up with, and they obviously took a liking to me. I was running about with people when I was 16, and they were probably in their late 20s. But it felt good, it was part of something, and I was safe. And that idea of belonging has come up already, and safety. Obviously, from losing the sight of my left eye and stuff like that there, and then a few weeks before, I got attacked in a house in North Belfast when I was with my girlfriend. And obviously I got beat years ago as well, and got hit around the back of the head with a baseball bat. But I never went for help, because at the time I didn't need help. I couldn't ask for help, because it was just taken, like, in my head. I didn't think I needed the help. Do you know what I mean? Because all of the drugs I was taking, I thought I was just normal. This is the way it was meant to be. It's just what happens to everyone. Do you know what I mean? Which is quite, so that's a reflection of one guy who was involved in this study, but a lot in it, that the messages were really consistent across the range of this research that I'm talking about. You know, the whole idea of norms and acceptance of socialisation, of the use of aggression, is tolerated, and in some of the, maybe not in this one, but in some ways, it's not just tolerated, but it's accepted and celebrated. But also missed opportunities. Missed opportunities has come across really consistently. You know, this isn't just an issue for, you know, we kind of traditionally think of responding to these issues as a police matter. You know, there's a lot of health issues on here. There's mental health issues. There's educational issues. There's community issues. These issues are wrapped up and so cross-cutting that it actually affects a whole range of not just people's lives, but of sectors as well. And so what kind of has come out, I guess, is that not just is mental health has come up. I think Chris was saying his priority, one of the strategic priorities for Nicky's mental health. Katie had mentioned young people's priorities are consistently around mental health. It's bound to come up, you know, again and again. And in regard to violence, what we know from the wider research, but also what we see from what young people are saying, particularly young men, what they're saying, is that being exposed to violence, living in violent communities, being the victims of violence is trauma-inducing, but also that trauma is violence-inducing. And that fits with these terms that we've become familiar with, you know, this idea of the cycle of violence. You know, people who are victims are much more likely to become the perpetrators, and the perpetrators are much more likely to be the victims again. So we need to understand these cycles and interrupt those cycles and find ways to interrupt them. And I suppose this is where now hopefully the tone changes a little, and there's a wee bit of optimism instilled. So there has been significant work, not just trying to understand the profiles of people most affected and the harms and the impact, but also what do we do about it. And so academia is also making, I hope, some headway along with partners in policy and in the community around what do we do about this. So what, you know, we've got all these insights from research and lessons and you know, empirical findings. So what are we going to do with it? So what's becoming increasingly popular, I guess, in conversation is this idea of public health response, where we see big complex issues nested within a range of potential responses, ranging from primary, where you try to prevent things happening in the first place, right through to what's called tertiary, and that's for people most affected who are experiencing really acute need. And we can plot a whole range of investments that have been made, particularly by the executive programme, around testing and evaluating these interventions. And I'm just going to, just to very quickly, so what we have, for instance, awareness raising, where there's a media campaign that most of us will probably be familiar with, around the raising awareness of the range of harms that can be caused by violence and criminality and organised crime, right through to something like In Sync, which is a novel therapeutic project that's currently being led by NACRO, and that's specifically for victims of serious violence. But what I want to just finish on is a quick overview of a different model. It's been co-produced by ourselves at Queen's and youth workers who are working with young men. And I guess it's built upon these insights from research, personal reflections, and also the insights from our locally implemented studies. You know, we need to recognise there's a few things going on. First of all, boys and young men are much more likely to endorse violence, to use violence and aggression, and whenever they do, they get that reinforcement quite often. So there's a highly socialised element to this. But what the boys and young men are also saying consistently is that they have very few safe spaces to reflect on where they get these ideas from, and more importantly, what alternatives are there to them, and how do they practice and rehearse these alternatives. Positive relationships, if they don't have positive relationships, they're not going to be able to become aware of these issues and the impact that it has on them, and also to rehearse some alternatives. And youth work offers a real opportunity, I think. You know, schools have been well tested. You know, schools are important places and spaces, but they need to be complemented with non-formal educational spaces as well, particularly for those who are most vulnerable and who've been traditionally referred to as at risk, and maybe not even in school. You know, we need alternative spaces that young people feel comfortable in, they feel safe in, that they have relationships with youth workers in, and this offers real promise, I think, to not just engage and to provide safety, but also to create learning opportunities around violence. And this is a study where I guess this was demonstrated quite robustly. You'll not be able to make out these triangles, but essentially what this study was showing was that increased social support, even if young men experience the same adversities, even if they're the victims of the same form of violence, what makes the difference? That's a big question, because we know that not everybody's impacted the same way. What this study showed, that at least in part, social support, having somebody there that cared for them, could listen to them, help them make sense of things, had a significant impact on reducing psychological stress, and in turn psychological stress had an impact on reducing the chances of them engaging in violence. So there's a really important insight and backs up that finding around the potential for youth work in this space. So I'm coming towards the end here, and I think amplifying the voice of young people, particularly of young men, is probably more important than listening to 20 minutes of me and research insights. So this is a really powerful, I guess, reflection from two young men around the need for safe spaces and the potential for that.
To be brutally honest, man, if we didn't have our space and our space wasn't in this town, there's a lot of people, a lot of us boys that probably wouldn't be here right now. The amount of support that this place actually gives us it really, really is. You can come down here in your darkest of times, hey, and they'll bring you into a room, they'll talk to you, they'll bring you down to base level, cool and calm the whole situation, and really give you a reality check, if you know what I mean, if you really need it, a place like this.
They helped me through my darkest moments, but then they got me involved in a lot of stuff, and I thank all space what they actually give to me. They show you that much respect. You be thankful for every bit of it, no matter what. If you're feeling down, depressed, anything,
this is the place you want to be.
This is the actual place that you want to be.
Honestly, like this place it's just so perfect that where it's situated in this town. If it wasn't here, you'd have all these wings that would be in here, all the youth. and they wouldn't know what to do themselves, because this is the little place that they come to, that they can have their own time, that they can be away from everybody else, their little safe space where they can come talk about their problems, where they can really become whole as a person, find themselves so they can. And these people in here, and by the God's honest truth, they are brilliant people, and I really do urge anybody that is about here that needs help or just needs somewhere to go during the day, just to come here, because honestly it's just so amazing here.
Just even come and clear your mind, because they will help you and they will talk to you and they will never judge you of what you did, what you done. They will help you to get your mind as clear as anything, to make you to feel good in yourself. And I thank all space very much what you done for me, because of my feeling, because I was literally gonna do something that I didn't want to do.
If you didn't have those one-to-ones, where would you be right now?
Not here talking about all space.
It's a fact, my brother's still fucking here because of it, and I'm proud of this place because of that.
So that's far more powerful than anything I could say. Those two, you know, that's just coming from a place that I guess that's just their own reflection. So I think I've about 30 seconds left. So I guess one of the key findings from all of this is that they need spaces. You know, we need safe spaces. We need safe spaces in communities. You know, in the context of communities where there are a range of harms. But you know, aside from being able to reduce and eliminate and mitigate all those harms, the safe spaces can have a big impact, and it's shown to have an impact. We're beginning to see that. The research isn't just supporting practitioners and youth workers to design these safe spaces and create frameworks and projects around that, but also generating the evidence that says this is having an impact. One of them is the Y-Box. It's a model that was co-designed by Queen's and the EA. It's what we call a gender transformative programme, insofar as that it's recognising that the lives of boys and young men are different from the lives of girls and young women, and they need spaces to reflect on what that means and where these ideas come from, and if they're helpful or harmful. And through that process, I guess that a theory of change has emerged, and I'll probably just end on this. And really, the theory of change for Y-Box is that by creating those safe spaces for young men to critically reflect on the gender and behavioural norms that influence their social lives, they can understand their complex relationship with violence, as well as their responses to violence. But importantly, they can consider and test and rehearse and then put into place feasible non-violent responses. So I have a limited number of copies. If people are interested, you're more than welcome to lift a copy of this. You're more than welcome to get in touch. You know, if you want to find out any more of that, these are some of the QR codes for the papers I was referring to. You know, a bit like what Isaac was alluding to. There's a lot going on here. It's a complex issue that cuts across a range of years and a range of reports. But collectively, I think he was very helpful in suggesting that, you know, keeping it simple. It's probably 3 key points. You know, amplify the voices of young men, understand the relationship with violence, and figure out how we can work together to do something about it, I guess.
Thank you.